The windswept plains of Montana stretched endlessly beyond the broken fence posts, and Sarah Martinez clutched her eviction notice as she stared at the abandoned ranch house that was supposed to save her. 8 months pregnant with nowhere else to go, she'd driven 12 hours on her last tank of gas to claim an inheritance from a great aunt whose name she'd never heard. But as Sarah pushed open the creaking front door, her breath caught. Hidden beneath decades of dust and decay, the walls were lined with oil paintings worth millions. In the basement, she found safety deposit box keys and documents revealing her family's involvement in a century-old gold heist that had never been solved. What Sarah didn't know was that others had been watching the ranch for decades, waiting for someone to return and claim what was hidden there, the same people who had killed her great-aunt 60 years ago. Now, with her baby due any day and dangerous men closing in, Sarah faced an impossible choice: flee with nothing or stay and fight for a fortune that could cost her everything. But why had her great-aunt left her the ranch, and what other secrets lay buried in the Montana soil? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the musty documents on what remained of an oak kitchen table. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her anxiety. She'd come here expecting nothing more than a roof over her head. Any roof would have been better than sleeping in her beaten-down Honda Civic for another night. The lawyer's letter had been brief and impersonal. "Congratulations, Ms. Martinez. You are the sole beneficiary of Esperanza Martinez's estate, including the property located at 1247 Cottonwood Creek Road." Sarah had never heard of Esperanza Martinez, but the same last name had given her hope. Maybe, finally, the universe was throwing her a lifeline. Now, standing in the dim light filtering through grimy windows, she wondered if she'd stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple inheritance. The paintings alone were enough to make her head spin. Even through the dust and grime, she could see the quality of the brushwork, the rich oils that spoke of masters whose names she'd only seen in art history books. A landscape that looked suspiciously like a Monet hung crooked above a stone fireplace. In the hallway, what appeared to be a Van Gogh, an actual Van Gogh, watched her with swirling blue eyes. Sarah pulled out her phone to take pictures, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. She was 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but prairie grass and the ghosts of whoever had lived here before. The basement had been the real revelation. Hidden behind what looked like a wine cellar, she discovered a small room containing a safe that stood open and empty. Scattered on the floor were yellowed newspaper clippings dating back to 1924, headlines screaming about a train robbery that had netted the thieves over $2 million in gold coins. The money had never been recovered. The thieves had never been caught. And there, in spidery handwriting on the margin of one article, someone had written, "They got what they deserved. E.M. Esperanza Martinez." Sarah lowered herself carefully into a dusty armchair, her back aching from the long drive and the weight she carried. The eviction notice crinkled in her pocket, $47 and 3 days. That's what her life had been reduced to before this morning. Her ex-boyfriend had disappeared the moment she'd told him about the pregnancy, taking their joint savings account with him. Her job at the diner had cut her hours until there were no hours left to cut. Her landlord had run out of patience. But this changed everything. If the paintings were authentic, if she could somehow prove ownership, if she could find a way to sell them quietly, she could give her child the life she'd dreamed of. College funds, a real home, security. A sound outside made her freeze, the distinctive crunch of gravel under tires. Sarah struggled to her feet and peered through a gap in the curtains. A black pickup truck was making its way slowly down the long dirt road that led to the ranch. It moved with purpose, not like someone who was lost. A heart hammered against her chest. She was completely alone out here, with no way to call for help and no way to run. The car barely had enough gas to make it back to the main highway. The truck stopped about 50 yards from the house. 2 men got out, both wearing dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low. They stood beside their vehicle for a long moment, studying the house. Sarah backed away from the window, her mind racing. Maybe they were just locals checking on the old place. Maybe they were real estate agents. Maybe they were completely harmless. But as she watched them approach the front door with measured, careful steps, she knew with bone-deep certainty that they were none of those things. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah pressed her hand to her belly protectively. The bus wheezed to a stop at what could generously be called a crossroads, though it looked more like a place where two dirt paths had given up trying to be real roads. Sarah pressed her face to the grimy window, searching for any sign of civilization beyond the endless stretch of scrubland and the single weathered sign that read Millbrook, Pop 847. The driver, a grizzled man who'd barely spoken during the 12-hour journey, turned in his seat. "This is as close as I get to the Whitmore place. You sure about this, miss?" Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly. At 6 months pregnant, every decision felt monumental, and this one felt particularly insane. But the $47 in her wallet and the eviction notice in her purse had made the choice for her. "I'm sure," she lied, gathering her single duffel bag and the manila envelope containing her great-aunt's will. The desert heat hit her like a physical blow as she stepped off the bus. She'd grown up in Oregon's green valleys, where the air held moisture and promise. This place felt like the end of the world, all bleached bones and false horizons. "Whitmore Ranch is about 8 miles that way," the driver called through his open door, pointing toward a cluster of distant mountains. "Follow the fence line. Can't miss it." The bus pulled away in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes, leaving Sarah alone with the vastness of New Mexico sky. She'd never felt so small or so foolish. What kind of desperate woman travels across 3 states to claim property from a relative she'd never heard of? The kind whose boyfriend disappears when he learns about the pregnancy, leaving behind only unpaid bills and empty promises, she reminded herself. The kind who gets fired from her waitressing job for missing too many shifts due to morning sickness. The kind who has nowhere else to go. She started walking. The fence line the bus driver mentioned turned out to be mostly theoretical, rusted posts connected by the memory of barbed wire, stretching across rolling hills dotted with juniper and sage. Her sneakers, already worn thin, began to protest against the rocky ground within the first mile. By the 3rd mile, she was rationing sips from her water bottle and questioning every life choice that had led her here. The baby kicked, a flutter of movement that made her pause. "I know this is crazy," she whispered to her belly, "but sometimes crazy is all you've got left." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rust, Sarah crested a low hill and saw it, the Whitmore Ranch. Even in the forgiving light of late afternoon, it looked like something that had been broken and forgotten decades ago. The main house, a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof, might have been beautiful once. Now it sagged in the middle like an old horse, its windows dark and several of its tiles missing. Outbuildings scattered around the property in various states of collapse, a barn with a caved-in roof, corrals with gates hanging open like slack jaws, and what might have been a bunkhouse that was now home to more tumbleweeds than people. A newer pickup truck sat in the circular drive, and Sarah's heart sank. Had she misunderstood the lawyer's letter? Was someone else living here? As she approached the house, the front door opened, and a man stepped onto the covered porch. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades under the desert sun. He wore jeans, worn boots, and an expression of polite wariness. "You must be Sarah Chen," he said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of the region. "I'm Jake Reeves, your neighbor to the south. Mrs. Martinez at the post office called when she saw someone walking out this way." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Small towns and their invisible networks of information. "I inherited this place from my great-aunt, Catherine Whitmore." Something flickered across Jake's face at the mention of the name, too quick to interpret. Catherine was a hell of a woman, I'm sorry for your loss. I never actually knew her, Sarah admitted. This whole thing came as a surprise. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes taking in her pregnant state and single bag. Long way to come for a surprise. You planning to stay? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah looked past him at the crumbling house, at the vast emptiness that was now supposedly hers, at the mountains that seemed to wall off the rest of the world. It was nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd scraped together bus fare and left everything familiar behind. I don't know, she said finally. I guess we'll find out. Jake pulled a set of keys from his pocket and held them out to her. Catherine asked me to keep an eye on the place until family came for it. Never thought anyone actually would. The courthouse in Cedar Falls looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. Peeling paint clung desperately to wooden window frames, and the American flag hung limp in the still morning air. Sarah adjusted her grip on her purse, the same battered leather bag that now contained every dollar she owned, and pushed through the heavy oak doors. The probate office smelled of dust and old paper. Behind a metal desk sat a woman who looked to be in her 60s, steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She glanced up from her typewriter with the expression of someone perpetually annoyed by interruptions. I'm Sarah Chen, Sarah said, approaching the desk. I have an appointment about the Whitmore estate. The woman's demeanor shifted slightly, curiosity replacing irritation. Ah, yes, the mysterious heir. I'm Dorothy Hutchins, county clerk. We've been wondering when you'd show up. She pulled a manila folder from a stack and opened it. I have to say, in 30 years of handling probate matters, I've never seen anything quite like this. Sarah lowered herself into the rickety chair across from the desk, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. What do you mean? Dorothy adjusted her glasses and pulled out a document. Your great-aunt, Cordelia Whitmore, left very specific instructions. The property was to remain untouched until you claimed it, and only you could claim it. Not your parents, not any other relative. Just Sarah Chen, daughter of Margaret Whitmore Chen. I don't understand. My mother never mentioned having an aunt named Cordelia. That's not uncommon in families with... Dorothy paused, choosing her words carefully, complicated histories. The Whitmore family had their share of complications. She handed Sarah a set of keys, their metal warm from her palm. The ranch is about 15 miles northeast of town. Take County Road 7 until you see the broken mailbox with Whitmore painted on it. Can't miss it. It's the only structure for miles that looks like it's still standing, barely. Sarah examined the keys. One was clearly for a door, old brass worn smooth by decades of use. The other was smaller, more ornate, with an unusual design etched into its head. What's this smaller one for? Dorothy's expression grew guarded. I wouldn't know. Cordelia never said, but she was very insistent that both keys go to you and you alone. Tell me about her. About Cordelia. Kept to herself mostly. Came into town maybe once a month for supplies. Paid in cash. Never caused trouble. Never said much beyond pleasantries. She was watchful, if that makes sense, like she was always looking over her shoulder. Sarah felt a chill despite the stuffy office. Was she afraid of something? Hard to say. The Whitmore family used to be prominent around these parts, back in the 1800s. Owned a lot of land, had money. But families like that, they tend to collect secrets along with their wealth. Dorothy closed the folder with a snap. Speaking of which, there's one more thing. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Sarah's name was written across it in spidery handwriting. Cordelia left this for you specifically. Instructions were that I could only give it to you after you'd claimed the keys. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she took the envelope. The paper felt fragile, as if it might crumble at her touch. How long ago did she write this? Based on the postmark, about 3 years ago. But she updated her will every year, always with the same instructions about you. Every year? But how did she even know I existed? Dorothy leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with renewed interest. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Your mother left Cedar Falls when she was barely 18. As far as I know, she never came back, never contacted anyone here. Yet Cordelia always knew exactly where you were, what you were doing. She even knew about—" Her gaze dropped meaningfully to Sarah's belly. Sarah's heart began to race. "That's impossible. The inheritance letter was dated 6 months ago. Check the envelope." Sarah looked more closely at the envelope in her hands. In the corner, barely visible, was a date stamp from just 2 weeks ago, long after Cordelia's death. Her hands began to shake. "I don't understand any of this." "Neither do I," Dorothy admitted. "But I'll give you some free advice. The Whitmore Ranch isn't just remote, it's isolated. Cell service is spotty at best. If you're planning to stay out there, make sure someone knows where you are." Sarah stood, clutching the keys and envelope. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, then leaned forward. 3 people have died on that property in the last 50 years. Could be coincidence. Could be that old places are dangerous places. But if I were you, especially in your condition, I'd be very careful about what doors I opened with those keys." The baby kicked then, as if responding to the warning. Sarah placed her hand over the movement, suddenly feeling very alone in a town where even the dead seemed to be keeping secrets. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Sarah made her way to the main house, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. She'd spent a restless night in the foreman's quarters, her mind churning over the photograph and the questions it raised. The baby had been particularly active, as if sensing her unease, and she'd barely managed a few hours of sleep. The front door of the main house stood slightly ajar, creaking in the morning breeze. Sarah hesitated before pushing it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through grimy windows. The air smelled of old wood and something else, something faintly metallic that made her stomach turn. She moved through the rooms methodically, searching for any clue about her great-aunt's life. The parlor contained a few pieces of furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts frozen in time. In what must have been Ruth's bedroom, she found clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, simple dresses, worn work shirts, and a single black dress that looked like it had never been worn. It was in the kitchen that she found the first real evidence of Ruth's daily existence. A cup sat on the table, a ring of dried coffee staining the bottom. Beside it lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it to the most recent entry, dated just 3 weeks ago. "The dreams are getting worse," Ruth had written in a spidery hand. "I see Elizabeth's face every night, hear her screaming. The guilt never leaves. Maybe it's time to tell someone the truth about what really happened that night in 1953. Sarah's blood ran cold. Elizabeth, the woman in the photograph. She flipped back through the pages, scanning Ruth's increasingly frantic entries. References to the money appeared frequently, along with cryptic mentions of paying for our sins and keeping the secret buried. A sound from outside made her look up sharply. Through the kitchen window, she saw a black pickup truck rumbling up the drive, dust billowing in its wake. Her heart hammered as she recognized the vehicle. It was the same one she'd seen watching her yesterday. The truck stopped near the porch, and 2 men got out. The first was tall and lean, wearing an expensive-looking hat and boots that had clearly never seen real ranch work. The second man was shorter but broader, with the kind of face that suggested violence was always an option. Sarah clutched the journal to her chest and backed away from the window. She needed to hide, but where? The house was too open, too exposed. Then she remembered the root cellar she'd glimpsed yesterday. There had been a door in the kitchen floor, barely visible under a threadbare rug. Heavy footsteps echoed on the front porch. Sarah quickly pulled back the rug, revealing a wooden trapdoor with an iron ring for a handle. She tugged it open, wincing at the loud creak, and peered into the darkness below. A wooden ladder descended into what looked like a small storage space. Ruth Blackwood left this place to someone. She heard one of the men saying, "Boss wants us to make sure they understand the situation." "What if they already found it?" the second man replied, his voice rougher, more threatening. "Then we make sure they give it back, along with everything else." Sarah lowered herself into the cellar as quietly as possible, pulling the trapdoor closed above her head just as she heard the kitchen door open. The space was cramped and musty, filled with the smell of old potatoes and earth. She felt around in the darkness, trying to orient herself, when her hand brushed against something unexpected: metal bars. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through cracks in the floorboards above, she realized she wasn't in a simple root cellar. This was something else entirely. The metal bars formed a cage of sorts, and beyond them she could make out shapes in the darkness: boxes, crates, and what looked like an old safe. Above her head, she could hear the men moving through the house, their boots heavy on the wooden floors. They were searching for something, opening drawers and moving furniture. One of them was directly overhead now, in the kitchen. "Check every inch," the first man said. Ruth was crazy, but she wasn't stupid. If the money's here, she would have hidden it good. Sarah pressed herself against the earthen wall, hardly daring to breathe. The journal was still clutched in her hands, and she could feel the baby shifting restlessly inside her. Whatever these men were looking for, it was connected to Ruth's secret, and to the mysterious Elizabeth in the photograph. A board creaked ominously above her head, and dust filtered down onto her face. She closed her eyes and prayed that the old floorboards would hold, that the rug would stay in place, and that these men would leave before they discovered her hiding place. But even as she made these desperate wishes, she knew her troubles were just beginning. The coffee had grown cold in Sarah's hands as she stared at the photograph until her eyes burned. Dawn crept through the kitchen window, casting pale light across the scattered documents that had kept her awake all night. The woman in the sepia-toned image looked so much like her own reflection that it made her stomach churn with an unease that had nothing to do with morning sickness. She traced her finger along the edge of the photograph, where someone had written in faded ink, "Eleanor Whitmore, 1892. The handwriting was different from Aunt Cordelia's spidery script, suggesting this picture had been labelled long before it came into her great-aunt's possession. A sharp knock at the front door made Sarah jump, sending coffee splashing across the table. She grabbed a dish towel and quickly gathered the documents into a pile, her protective instincts flaring. Through the window she could see a black pickup truck parked in her driveway and a man in a sheriff's uniform standing on her porch. "Mrs. Chen?" His voice carried through the door, authoritative but not unkind. "Sheriff Mason, I'd like to speak with you about your aunt." Sarah's pulse quickened as she opened the door. The sheriff was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with graying temples and tired eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His gaze lingered on her swollen belly before meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, removing his hat. "Mind if I come in? I have some questions about Cordelia Whitmore's passing." "Questions?" Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of the papers she'd hastily covered with the dish towel. "I thought she died of natural causes." Sheriff Mason's boots echoed on the hardwood floors as he surveyed the kitchen. His eyes paused on the covered documents before returning to her face. "That's what we initially believed. But some things have come to light that suggest we should take another look." Sarah's mouth went dry. "What kind of things? When did you last speak with your aunt, Mrs. Chen?" "I never spoke with her. I didn't even know she existed until the lawyer contacted me." Sarah eased herself into a chair, her back aching from the sleepless night. "What's this really about, Sheriff?" Mason pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "Your aunt was found dead in her bedroom 3 weeks ago. Doc Peterson said it looked like heart failure, which wouldn't be unusual for a woman her age. But yesterday we received an anonymous tip suggesting we might want to examine the scene more carefully." "Anonymous tip?" The words came out sharper than Sarah intended. "What did they say?" "That Cordelia Whitmore had been asking questions about things that happened on this ranch a long time ago, things that certain people in town would prefer stayed buried." Mason's eyes never left her face. The caller suggested that maybe someone wanted to make sure she stopped digging. Sarah felt the baby shift inside her, a flutter that usually brought comfort, but now felt like a warning. "You think someone killed her?" "I think your aunt was afraid of something in the weeks before she died. She came into town several times, asking about old records, old families. She was particularly interested in anything related to the Whitmore name from the 1890s. The photograph of Eleanor Whitmore seemed to burn through the dish towel covering it. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to not glance toward the table where evidence of her own investigation lay hidden. "Mrs. Chen, did your aunt leave you anything besides the ranch? Any papers, photographs, personal items?" "Just some old furniture and household things," Sarah lied, surprised by how easily the deception came. Nothing that seemed important. Sheriff Mason made a note in his book, then looked up at her with those penetrating eyes. "You should know that there's been some talk in town about you inheriting this place. Some folks aren't happy about an outsider owning Whitmore land." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that starts with grumbling at the diner and sometimes ends with broken windows and slashed tires." Mason's voice remained level, but there was a warning in it. "I'm not trying to scare you, but you should be aware that this ranch has a complicated history in Millbrook. Your aunt kept to herself, but you're new, and people notice new." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying you should be careful. Keep your doors locked. Don't go wandering around alone after dark, and call me if anything seems off." Mason handed her a business card. "And Mrs. Chen, if you happen to find anything among your aunt's belongings that might explain why someone wanted to silence her, I'd appreciate a call." After he left, Sarah sat in the growing daylight, staring at his card. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her fear. She pulled the dish towel away from the documents and looked again at Eleanor Whitmore's haunting face. Whatever secrets this ranch held, people had killed for them before, and they might kill again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards as Sarah knelt beside the loose board in what had once been Aunt Miriam's bedroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the crowbar she'd found in the barn, each creak of the old wood echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. The board finally gave way with a groan that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Beneath it lay a metal strongbox, its surface green with age but still solid. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted it out, surprised by its weight. The lock had long since rusted, and with a few careful strikes from the crowbar, it fell away. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the dampness at bay, were bundles of bills, not the crisp modern currency she was used to, but older denominations, some dating back to the 1950s. Her breath caught as she counted, nearly $15,000, more money than she'd ever seen in one place. But it was what lay beneath the money that made her blood run cold. A leather journal, its pages yellowed with age, filled with spidery handwriting in faded ink. The first entry was dated September 1953, written in a feminine hand that grew increasingly erratic as the pages progressed. "The Blackwood brothers came again today. Ezra's threats are getting bolder. He knows Papa found the vein, knows it runs deeper than anything they've pulled from their claim. But Papa won't sell. Says this land has been in our family too long to hand it over to murderers." Sarah flipped through several pages, her unease growing with each entry. The journal chronicled a bitter dispute between her family and the Blackwoods, a prominent ranching family who apparently wanted the land for reasons that went far beyond cattle grazing. "Found Papa by the creek this morning. Sheriff says he slipped and hit his head on the rocks, but I know better. The bruises on his knuckles tell a different story. Ezra Blackwood was at the funeral, had the nerve to offer his condolences and ask about selling again. I told him what Papa would have said, over my dead body." The final entries were the most disturbing. "They burned the southern pasture last night. Warning shot, I suppose, but they don't know about the mine entrance Papa showed me before he died, or the gold we've already pulled from it. Every nugget is hidden away, waiting for the day when justice comes for the Blackwoods. If something happens to me, I pray whoever finds this will finish what Papa started. The proof is in the mine, the real proof of what they've done, what they're capable of." May 15th, 1954. This will be my last entry. I can hear horses approaching, and I recognize Ezra's voice among them. I've hidden what I can where they'll never find it. The mine entrance is behind the false wall in the root cellar. Follow the creek upstream 200 yards from the house. The gold is there, but more importantly, so is Papa's evidence. 3 generations of Blackwood crimes, all documented and hidden away. If they think they can scare me into silence like they did Papa, they're about to learn otherwise. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the journal. The silence of the old house suddenly felt oppressive, weighted with the ghosts of long-buried secrets. She thought of the modern pickup truck she'd seen on the road yesterday, the one that had slowed as it passed the ranch entrance. The driver had been too far away to identify, but something about the way he'd lingered had made her uneasy. Rising carefully from her knees, she cradled her growing belly with one hand while clutching the journal with the other. The baby chose that moment to kick, a strong flutter that reminded her she wasn't just responsible for her own safety anymore. From somewhere outside came the sound of an engine, growing closer. Sarah moved to the window and peered through the dusty glass. A black SUV was turning into her drive, moving slowly as if the occupants were surveying the property. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the deliberate pace. This wasn't a casual visit or someone who'd taken a wrong turn. The vehicle stopped near the front porch, and 2 men emerged. They wore expensive boots and crisp shirts that marked them as more than simple ranch hands. The older of the two, a man with silver hair and cold eyes, looked directly at the window where she stood. Even from a distance, his smile sent chills down her spine. Sarah stepped back from the window, her mind racing. The journal had mentioned 3 generations of Blackwood crimes. If these men were descendants of the family that had terrorized her great-aunt, then her discovery of the hidden fortune was about to become far more complicated than she'd imagined. The sound of boots on the wooden porch steps echoed through the house, followed by a firm knock on the front door. Sarah clutched the journal tighter, acutely aware that she was alone, pregnant, and apparently in possession of secrets that people had already killed to protect. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and a voice called out with false friendliness that made her skin crawl. "Miss Hartwell, we'd like to have a word." The storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally broke just as Elena finished burying the leather pouch beneath the loose floorboard in her bedroom. Rain hammered against the windows with such ferocity that she wondered if the old glass would hold. Lightning illuminated the ranch house in stark, flickering moments that made every shadow seem alive with menace. She pressed her hand against her growing belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Even her unborn child seemed to sense the tension that had settled over the property like a shroud. The revelation about the Clearwater massacre had shaken something loose in her understanding of this place, of the weight she'd inherited along with the deed. Thunder crashed overhead as Elena made her way to the kitchen, drawn by an inexplicable urge to examine the daguerreotype once more. But as she reached for the photograph on the kitchen table, she realized it wasn't where she'd left it. Her pulse quickened. She'd placed it face down beside the coffee tin. She was certain of that. Now it sat propped against the sugar bowl, the stern faces of her ancestors staring directly at her. The wind howled through gaps in the window frames, but underneath that sound, Elena heard something else. Footsteps on the front porch, heavy, deliberate. She froze, straining to listen over the storm's fury. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. Elena's mouth went dry. Who would venture out in weather like this? And how had they navigated the washed-out road she'd barely managed that morning? She crept to the front window, peering through the rain-streaked glass, but saw only darkness beyond the weak glow of her porch light. Another series of knocks, more insistent this time. Elena grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen drawer, her heart hammering against her ribs. She approached the door slowly, acutely aware of how alone she was out here, how the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. "Who's there?" she called through the heavy wooden door. "Sheriff's Department, ma'am. Deputy Harrison. Need to speak with you about some recent incidents in the area." Elena hesitated. The voice sounded official enough, but something about it struck her as wrong. Too smooth, too practiced, She'd grown up in neighborhoods where you learned to distinguish between genuine authority and those who merely wore its mask. "Can you show me some identification?" she asked, not moving toward the door. A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the storm's chaos. When the voice came again, its tone had shifted slightly, losing that carefully modulated authority. "Ma'am, I'm getting soaked out here. Could you just open up so we can talk properly?" Elena backed away from the door. A real deputy wouldn't have dropped the formalities so quickly, and wouldn't have said "we" when he'd claimed to be alone. She clutched the knife tighter, her pregnancy making her feel even more vulnerable than she already was. The doorknob turned slowly. Elena's blood turned to ice. She'd locked that door, she was certain of it, but somehow it was opening anyway. Through the widening gap, she glimpsed not a uniform, but dark clothing that seemed to absorb the meager light. She didn't wait to see more. Elena bolted toward the back of the house, moving as quickly as her pregnant body would allow. Behind her, she heard the front door slam open, followed by heavy footsteps that made no attempt at stealth. The back door stuck, swollen from the rain and years of neglect. Elena yanked at it desperately while footsteps approached down the hallway. When it finally gave way, she stumbled out into the storm. Rain immediately soaked through her clothes, and wind nearly knocked her sideways, but she pressed forward into the darkness. Lightning revealed the landscape in brief, terrifying snapshots. The barn looming ahead, the fence posts marking boundaries she was only beginning to understand. Elena struggled through the mud toward the barn, hoping to find shelter and perhaps another way out. Her ancestors had survived whatever threats this land held. She had to believe she could do the same. She reached the barn just as another lightning flash illuminated a second figure emerging from the house. Two of them, just as the voice had inadvertently revealed. Elena slipped inside the barn, pressing herself against the wall, trying to control her breathing. The barn offered little comfort. Tools hung from hooks like instruments of torture, and the darkness seemed to press against her from all sides. But in the far corner, barely visible in the gloom, she spotted something that made her heart leap: a root cellar door, partially hidden beneath scattered hay. As footsteps approached the barn, Elena realized she was about to discover whether the secrets buried on this ranch would protect her or consume her. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if urging her forward into whatever darkness lay ahead. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the desert air crisp and clear. Maya stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold through the window. She'd barely slept, her mind churning over the photograph and the implications of what she'd discovered in that hidden compartment. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the glass, she could see Sheriff Coleman's weathered face beneath his hat brim. Her stomach tightened as she opened the door. "Morning, Miss Chen. Hope I'm not disturbing you too early." "Not at all." "Coffee?" He nodded gratefully and followed her to the kitchen. As she poured him a cup, Maya debated how much to tell him about last night's discovery. The photograph sat heavy in her mind, but something held her back from mentioning it. "I wanted to follow up on what we discussed yesterday," Coleman said, settling into a chair at the worn wooden table. "About your great-aunt's passing." Maya's hand stilled on the coffee pot. "Did you find something?" "Well, that's just it. I've been going through the old files, and there are some inconsistencies that bother me." He pulled out a small notebook. "The original incident report mentions Eleanor was found at the bottom of Eagles Canyon, but there's no mention of why she would have been out there in the first place. Maybe she was just walking." "At night? During a thunderstorm?" Coleman shook his head. "Eleanor was many things, but she wasn't foolish. She knew this land better than anyone." Maya set down her cup carefully. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. Just asking questions." His grey eyes studied her face. "Did you find anything else in the house? Anything that might explain why someone would want to hurt her?" The photograph seemed to burn against Maya's consciousness, but she found herself shaking her head. Nothing obvious. Coleman nodded slowly, but she sensed he wasn't entirely convinced. "One more thing. Doc Patterson mentioned you've been asking about getting the property appraised. Planning to sell? I'm considering my options. Maya's hand drifted unconsciously to her belly. I need to think about what's best for the baby. Understandable. Coleman finished his coffee and stood. Just be careful who you trust around here. This valley has a long memory, and not all the stories have happy endings. After he left, Maya felt the weight of his warning settle over her like a heavy blanket. She retrieved the photograph from where she'd hidden it beneath her mattress and studied it again in the morning light. The resemblance between herself and the woman in the image was even more striking now. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline. But it was the man beside her that captured Maya's attention. Something about his stance, the way he held himself, seemed familiar. She decided to search the house more thoroughly. If there was one hidden compartment, there might be others. Starting in Eleanor's bedroom, she methodically examined the walls, checking for loose boards or hidden panels. The baby kicked restlessly as she knelt to inspect the baseboards, reminding her she wasn't just investigating for herself anymore. In the study, she found herself drawn to the old roll-top desk. She'd searched the drawers before, but now she examined the desk itself more carefully. Running her fingers along the interior edges, she felt a slight give in one corner. Pressing harder, she heard a soft click, and a narrow panel slid aside, revealing another hiding place. Inside was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Maya's heart raced as she opened it and saw Eleanor's handwriting on the first page, dated just 3 months ago. If anyone reads this, it means they've found me out. Maya will inherit everything, but she needs to know the truth about what she's walking into. The Torrances have been circling this land like vultures for 60 years, ever since they learned about what's buried here. They killed my father for it, and now they'll come for her too. Maya's hands trembled as she turned the page. The next entry was even more chilling. Thomas Torrance came by again today, making his usual threats disguised as offers. He knows I won't sell, but he's getting desperate. I've seen his men watching the property at night. I'm scared they'll try something more direct soon. I've hidden the map where only family blood can find it. If something happens to me, Maya will need it to understand what she's inherited, both the treasure and the curse that comes with it. The journal slipped from Maya's fingers as a shadow passed by the window. She held her breath, listening. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside, slow and deliberate. Someone was circling the house. Maya quickly stuffed the journal into her jacket and moved quietly to peer through the curtains. A tall man in an expensive suit stood near the front porch, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. He wasn't trying to hide his presence. In fact, he seemed to be waiting for her to notice him. As their eyes met through the glass, he smiled and tipped his hat. Even from a distance, she could see the cold calculation in his expression. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Sarah made her way to the old well house, Marcus's words from the previous evening echoing in her mind. She'd barely slept, her thoughts churning between the revelation about the silver mine and the growing certainty that someone didn't want her here. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her unease. The well house stood apart from the main buildings, its weathered stone walls covered in creeping vines. Sarah had avoided it until now, assuming it was just another decrepit outbuilding. But Marcus had mentioned it specifically when talking about places Aunt Cordelia might have hidden things, and something in his tone suggested he knew more than he was saying. The heavy wooden door groaned on rusted hinges as Sarah pushed it open. Shafts of dusty sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating a circular stone well in the center of the small building. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic that made her wrinkle her nose. She approached the well cautiously, noting that the wooden cover looked newer than the rest of the structure. When she lifted it, instead of the expected dark water below, she found a rope ladder descending into shadows. Her heart began to race. "Hello?" she called softly into the depths, but only her own voice echoed back. 20 minutes later, armed with a flashlight from the house and every ounce of courage she could muster, Sarah began her descent. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and she had to move carefully, one hand protecting her belly. About 15 feet down, the shaft opened into a natural cave that had been expanded and reinforced with timber supports. The beam of her flashlight revealed an underground room that took her breath away. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound ledgers, metal strongboxes, and canvas bags that clinked when she touched them. But it was the far wall that made her gasp. It was covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by red string like a detective's investigation board. Sarah moved closer, her light playing across dozens of photographs spanning what looked like several decades. Many showed the Whitmore Ranch in its heyday, but others depicted people she didn't recognize. At the center of it all was a large photograph of a handsome man in a suit, his face circled in red ink. Someone had written murderer across it in Aunt Cordelia's distinctive handwriting. Below the photograph was a newspaper clipping from 1952. Mine owner Clayton Hayes dies in hunting accident. Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the article. Hayes had been found shot near the Whitmore property line, his death ruled accidental. But Cordelia's notes told a different story. Sarah traced the red strings with her finger, following connections between photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings. The pattern that emerged was damning. Clayton Hayes hadn't died in a hunting accident. He'd been murdered, and the Whitmore family was involved. But why? She pulled down one of the ledgers and flipped through pages of meticulous records. Cordelia had documented everything. Mining claims, property transfers, witness statements that contradicted the official story. According to these notes, Clayton Hayes had discovered that the silver mine extended far beyond the Whitmore property boundaries. He'd been planning to contest their claim when he died. A loose photograph slipped from between the pages, and Sarah bent to retrieve it. The image showed a group of men standing in front of the mine entrance, and she recognized a younger version of Sheriff Brennan among them. Her hands began to shake as she read the names written on the back: J. Brennan, T. Whitmore, D. Sullivan, C. Hayes, last photo before Clayton's accident. The pieces began falling into place. The sheriff's reluctance to investigate the break-ins, his warnings about leaving town, the way he'd dismissed her concerns. He wasn't just incompetent, he was protecting a secret that his own family was part of. Sarah photographed everything she could with her phone, though the weak signal this far underground meant she couldn't send them anywhere. She was about to climb back up when she heard voices from above, men talking in low, urgent tones near the well house. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized Sheriff Brennan's gravelly voice, though she couldn't make out the words. She switched off her flashlight and pressed herself against the stone wall, hardly daring to breathe. The baby chose that moment to deliver a sharp kick to her ribs, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. The voices grew fainter, but she waited another 10 minutes before climbing back up. When she finally emerged, the ranch yard was empty, but she found fresh tire tracks near the well house and a cigarette butt that was still warm. They knew she'd been here. Worse, they probably knew what she'd found. Sarah hurried back to the house, her mind racing. The hidden fortune wasn't just silver, it was evidence of a murder that powerful people had spent decades covering up. And now she was the only person who knew the truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Elena stood at the kitchen window, watching the unmarked sedan crawl up the dirt road toward the house. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby had been restless all night, as if sensing her growing unease. Marcus emerged from the barn, his face grim as he spotted the approaching vehicle. He'd been up since dawn, reinforcing the loose boards on the back porch, or so he claimed. Elena suspected he'd been keeping watch, anticipating exactly this kind of unwelcome visitor. The sedan came to a stop beside Elena's rusted pickup, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, his polished shoes immediately collecting dust from the dry earth. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of practiced smile that never reached the eyes. Elena recognized the type from her years waiting tables. Someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and barely concealed threats. "Miss Vasquez," the man called out as he approached the porch, his voice carrying an Eastern accent that seemed out of place in the desert landscape. "I'm Robert Caldwell. I believe we have some business to discuss." Elena stepped onto the porch, Marcus positioning himself slightly behind her, close enough to intervene if needed. "I don't recall having any business with you, Mr. Caldwell." His smile widened, though it remained cold. "I represent certain parties with an interest in this property. We understand you've recently inherited it from Catherine Brennan. What of it?" "Well, the thing is, Miss Vasquez, there are some complications regarding the inheritance. Questions about the legitimacy of certain claims." He pulled a leather briefcase from his car and extracted a thick folder. "You see, there were debts. Substantial debts that your great-aunt incurred before her death." Elena felt her stomach drop, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wasn't informed of any debts by the lawyer who handled the estate." "Small-town attorneys sometimes miss the bigger picture," Caldwell said with a dismissive wave. "These particular obligations were held by private parties. Very patient people, but patience has its limits." Marcus stepped forward. "What kind of debts?" Caldwell's gaze shifted to Marcus, and Elena caught a flicker of recognition in the older man's eyes that made her pulse quicken. "And you are?" "A friend," Marcus said simply. "How interesting. You know, you look familiar. Have we met?" "I don't think so." But Elena could see the tension in Marcus's shoulders, the way his hand moved closer to his hip, where she now knew he kept a concealed weapon. These two men knew each other, or at least knew of each other. "The debts," Caldwell continued, returning his attention to Elena, "amount to approximately $400,000. With interest, of course." Elena's knees nearly buckled. "400,000? That's impossible. Aunt Catherine barely had enough money to maintain this place." "Gambling debts have a way of accumulating quickly, Miss Vasquez, especially when someone develops a taste for high-stakes poker games in certain exclusive establishments." He opened the folder and showed her a stack of documents covered in what appeared to be Catherine's signature. "Your great-aunt was quite the card player, it seems." Elena studied the papers, her mind racing. The signatures looked authentic, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. Even if these debts are legitimate, they died with her. I'm not responsible for what she owed. "Ah, but that's where it gets complicated," Caldwell said, producing another document. "You see, the ranch itself was used as collateral, and now that you've accepted the inheritance, you've also accepted the associated liabilities. That's not how inheritance law works," Elena protested. "It is when the contracts were written by very creative legal minds, Miss Vasquez. The good news is, my clients are reasonable people. They're willing to settle for the property itself. You sign it over, and the debt disappears." Elena felt the baby kick sharply, as if protesting the threat to their newfound home. "And if I refuse?" Caldwell's smile finally disappeared entirely. "I don't think you want to find out. These people don't respond well to being told no." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Elena was acutely aware of the hidden room beneath the floorboards, of the fortune in gold that Caldwell and his clients apparently didn't know existed. But she was also aware of how vulnerable she was, how easily she could simply disappear into the vast emptiness of the desert. "I'll need time to review these documents with my own attorney," she said finally. "Of course, you have 48 hours. Caldwell returned the papers to his briefcase and handed Elena a business card. "I'll be staying at the motel in town. Don't keep me waiting too long, Miss Vasquez. My client's patience only extends so far." As his sedan disappeared down the road, Elena turned to Marcus, whose face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Who is he really?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Trouble, the kind that doesn't go away quietly." The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Sarah made her way back to the ranch house, the manila envelope clutched against her chest beneath her jacket. Rain lashed against the windows as she stepped inside, shaking droplets from her hair. The house felt different now. charged with secrets that seemed to pulse from the very walls. She spread the documents across the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she examined each piece. The birth certificate confirmed what she'd suspected. Thomas Whitmore had been born in 1889, not 1875, as all the family records claimed. Someone had deliberately altered his history, aging him by 16 years. But why? The answer lay in the second document, a newspaper clipping from the Denver Post, dated September 15, 1889. The headline made her breath catch: 17 killed in silver mine collapse, owner's son among the dead. Her eyes scanned the article, picking out key phrases: Thomas Whitmore Jr., age 19, negligence suspected, safety warnings ignored, families demand justice. Sarah sank into a chair, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress. Thomas Whitmore hadn't just fled some minor scandal, he'd been responsible for 17 deaths. The mine collapse that had made him rich enough to buy this ranch had been built on the graves of working men. Lightning illuminated the kitchen as she reached for the third document, a letter written in the same careful script she'd seen in Aunt Cordelia's journal. But this handwriting was different, older, more masculine. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded to brown. "My dearest son," it began, "if you are reading this, then the truth has finally surfaced, as I always feared it would. The money that built our empire, that gave you everything you have, came at a price I pray you never have to pay." Sarah read on, her heart pounding. Thomas Whitmore Sr. had known about the safety issues in the mine. He'd received warnings from his foreman, desperate pleas from the miners' families, even a formal inspection report declaring the tunnels unsafe. But the silver vein was too rich, the profits too tempting. He'd ordered the work to continue. "When the mountain claimed those souls," the letter continued, "I told myself it was an act of God. But God doesn't forge documents, son. God doesn't pay off coroners and newspaper editors. That was all me trying to protect our family name. I changed your birth year, created a new identity for you out west. I thought distance would wash away the blood on our hands." Thunder crashed overhead as Sarah turned to the final page. "But blood has a way of calling to blood, Thomas. The families of those dead miners swore an oath before they scattered to the winds. They would find us, no matter how far we ran, no matter how well we hid. They would see justice done, if not in this generation, then in the next, or the next after that. The Whitmore line would pay for what we took." Sarah's hands were shaking now. She thought of the mysterious fires, the cattle deaths, the feeling of being watched. Were these the descendants of those miners finally making good on their ancestors' promise? A soft knock at the front door made her jump. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see a figure on the porch, tall, wearing a dark coat, face obscured by the storm. Her pulse quickened as she remembered Marcus's warnings about strangers. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Sarah folded the documents quickly and tucked them into the kitchen drawer, then moved toward the door. "Who is it?" she called out. "Sarah Whitmore?" The voice was unfamiliar, gravelly with age. "My name is Joseph Ramirez. I believe you've been looking for answers about your family." She hesitated, her hand on the deadbolt. The name Ramirez had been in that newspaper article, one of the miners who died in the collapse. "What do you want?" "To finish something that should have been finished 130 years ago." There was no menace in his tone, just a bone-deep weariness. "My great-grandfather died in that mine, Mrs. Whitmore, along with his 2 sons. They left behind 7 children and a wife who never stopped grieving." Sarah's throat went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." A bitter laugh echoed through the rain. "You found the documents, didn't you? Cordelia said you were smart, that you wouldn't let sleeping dogs lie. She was right about that, at least. You knew Aunt Cordelia?" "Knew her? We've been dancing around each other for 40 years, her trying to make amends, me trying to decide whether the sins of the fathers should be visited on the children." His voice softened slightly. "She left specific instructions about you, about what to do when you finally learned the truth." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door. Everything was unraveling. all the safety and security she'd thought she'd found here dissolving like sugar in the rain. "What kind of instructions?" she whispered. The weight of the gun felt foreign in Sarah's hands as she crept through the darkness toward the old mining shaft. Behind her, Marcus moved like a shadow, his breathing barely audible despite the tension crackling between them. The moonlight cast eerie shapes across the desert landscape, transforming familiar rock formations into menacing silhouettes. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "Whoever's been watching the ranch knows we're getting close to something." Sarah's baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing the danger. She pressed her free hand to her belly, drawing strength from the life growing within her. Everything she was doing now was for this child, to secure their future and uncover the truth that had been buried for too long. The mining shaft loomed ahead, its wooden supports weathered and splintered by decades of harsh desert winds. Sarah remembered her great-aunt's cryptic journal entries about the heart of the mountain and where the ancestors sleep. Standing here now, those words took on new meaning. Marcus pulled out a flashlight, shielding its beam with his fingers. According to the old survey maps, this shaft connects to a network of tunnels that run directly under your ranch house. If someone's been moving around your property unseen, this would be how. They approached the entrance cautiously. The heavy wooden boards that had supposedly sealed the mine lay scattered on the ground, their rusted nails glinting in the moonlight. Fresh boot prints marked the dusty earth. Someone had been here recently. "Marcus," Sarah breathed, pointing to something carved into the rock face beside the entrance. Even in the dim light, she could make out the same symbol from her great-aunt's journal, a twisted tree with roots that looked more like grasping fingers. "The Blackwood family crest," Marcus said grimly. "Sarah, I think it's time I told you everything I know about your family's history with this place." Before he could continue, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the desert silence. Headlights swept across the landscape, still distant but closing fast. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. "We need to get inside," he urged. "Now." They slipped into the mine shaft just as the first truck came into view. The darkness swallowed them whole, thick and oppressive. Marcus's flashlight beam revealed a tunnel that stretched deeper into the mountain than Sarah had imagined possible. The walls were rough-hewn rock, but she could see places where the stone had been deliberately carved and smoothed. "Listen," Marcus whispered urgently as they moved deeper into the tunnel. "Your great-aunt Cordelia wasn't the first Blackwood woman to try to expose the family secret. There have been others over the generations, women who discovered what really happened during the gold rush, who tried to make things right." The tunnel began to slope downward, and Sarah could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on them. Her great-aunt's journal had mentioned feeling the burden of the earth in these passages. Now she understood what that meant. "What secret?" Sarah pressed, though part of her already feared the answer. "The Blackwood fortune wasn't built on legitimate mining claims," Marcus said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Your ancestors murdered an entire Tohono O'odham village to steal their sacred gold mine, the fortune that's been passed down through your family. It's all built on genocide." Sarah's step faltered. The weight of his words hit her harder than the oppressive darkness of the tunnel. "That's impossible. The family records were altered, hidden. Your great-aunt spent years piecing together the real story. She found evidence, documents, artifacts, even bodies." Marcus's flashlight beam caught something ahead, an opening in the tunnel wall. She was trying to return the land to the tribal council when she died. They emerged into a vast underground chamber, and Sarah gasped. The beam of Marcus's flashlight revealed walls lined with metal strongboxes and wooden crates. But more disturbing were the human remains carefully arranged along one wall, skulls and bones that had been preserved in the dry desert air for over a century. "The victims," Marcus said solemnly. "Your great-aunt brought them here, gathered them from where they'd been scattered and hidden. She was trying to give them a proper burial." Sarah approached the remains with reverence, her hand still pressed to her belly. The enormity of her family's crimes washed over her like a physical blow. All the wealth, all the land, it was all stolen, built on the bones of innocent people. The sound of voices echoed from the tunnel entrance. Their pursuers had found the mine. "There's another way out," Marcus said quickly, leading her toward the far end of the chamber. "But first," he grabbed one of the smaller strongboxes. "Your great-aunt's evidence, everything she gathered to prove what really happened." As they fled deeper into the mountain's heart, Sarah understood that inheriting the ranch had been more than just gaining property. She'd inherited a debt that could never truly be repaid, a responsibility that would define the rest of her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stood at the edge of the old cemetery, her hands trembling as she held the leather-bound journal she'd found hidden beneath loose floorboards in Eleanor's bedroom. The entries dated back 60 years, written in her great-aunt's careful script, and every page revealed another layer of the Hartwell family's buried sins. Dr. Caldwell approached quietly, his medical bag in hand. "You called early this morning. Everything all right with the baby?" Sarah turned, her face pale with exhaustion. "I need to know something, and I think you're the only person left who might have answers." She opened the journal to a page marked with a dried flower. Eleanor wrote about a doctor who helped her family keep secrets, a doctor who falsified death certificates and made people disappear from official records. Caldwell's expression grew guarded. "Sarah, you're under a lot of stress. Perhaps we should focus on—" "My great-grandfather didn't die in a mining accident, did he?" Sarah's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. According to this journal, he was murdered by the Blackwood family when they discovered he'd been secretly documenting their illegal mining operations on Hartwell land. The old doctor set down his bag and removed his hat, running weathered fingers through grey hair. "Your great-aunt swore me to secrecy 50 years ago. Some stones are better left unturned." "The stones have already been turned." Sarah flipped through more pages. "She wrote about you, Dr. Caldwell, how you helped her stage Thomas Hartwell's death to protect him from the same fate as his father, how you helped her hide the evidence of the Blackwood family's crimes." Caldwell stared at the weathered headstones surrounding them. Thomas was barely 20 when they came for him. Eleanor was desperate. The Blackwoods had money, influence, and no conscience. We made it look like consumption took him, buried an empty coffin, and sent him east with enough money to start over. But the fortune she hid, where did it really come from? "Evidence," Caldwell said quietly. "Eleanor spent decades collecting proof of the Blackwoods' illegal operations. When the old patriarch died and the family business started failing, she used that evidence, not for revenge, but for restitution. They paid her family what they'd stolen over generations, plus interest for their silence." Sarah felt the baby kick as a wave of understanding washed over her. The man who's been watching the ranch, the one who broke in, he's not some random criminal, is he? Marcus Blackwood, the last of his line and desperate to reclaim what his family lost. Eleanor's death brought him out of hiding. Caldwell picked up his medical bag. He knows about the evidence she collected, knows it could still destroy what's left of his family's reputation. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she remembered the cold eyes she'd glimpsed that night. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Documents proving they murdered miners who got too close to the truth. Proof they bribed officials and falsified land claims. Eleanor had photographs, receipts, even a confession letter from Marcus's grandfather before he died. Caldwell paused. She kept it all in a safe place, somewhere even I don't know about. Sarah closed the journal, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. That's why she left me the ranch. She needed someone with no ties to this place, someone the Blackwoods wouldn't immediately suspect. Eleanor watched you from afar for years. She knew about your situation, your character. She believed you were strong enough to handle the truth and smart enough to know what to do with it. The sound of an approaching vehicle made them both turn. Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulled up to the cemetery gate, dust swirling in its wake. The sheriff emerged, his expression grim. "Sarah, we need to talk. We found Marcus Blackwood's truck abandoned about 20 miles north of here. And there's something else." He walked toward them, pulling out his phone. "This was left under your front door sometime last night." Sarah's blood ran cold as she read the message on the screen. "The evidence for your life and the baby's. You have until sunset." Dr. Caldwell stepped closer. "Sarah, there's something else Eleanor wrote in that journal, isn't there? Something you haven't told us yet." Sarah nodded slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "She wrote about a key, a special key that opens something more than just a lock." She looked between the two men, "And I think I know where to find it." The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass around the headstones. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could swear she heard the sound of footsteps, deliberate and approaching. The game of cat and mouse that had begun with her arrival was about to reach its deadly conclusion. Time was running out, and Marcus Blackwood was getting closer. The cellar beneath the old barn felt like a tomb, heavy with the scent of earth and decades of secrets. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across stone walls that predated the ranch house by at least 50 years. Her breath came in short puffs, visible in the underground chill, and she pressed one hand protectively over her growing belly as she descended the narrow wooden steps. Marcus followed close behind, his own light revealing carved symbols etched into the stone, symbols that matched the ones they'd found in Aunt Minerva's journal. The same symbols that had appeared in the threatening letters left at Sarah's door. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing off the walls. "How long has this been down here?" Sarah's light found wooden crates stacked along the far wall, their surfaces marked with dates going back to the 1880s. But it was what lay beyond the crates that made her blood run cold. A makeshift altar of sorts, built from stacked stones, with blackened remains scattered around its base. "Not animal remains. We need to get out of here," she said, backing toward the stairs. "Wait." Marcus grabbed her arm gently. "Look at this." He'd found a leather-bound ledger sitting open on a crude wooden table. The pages were yellowed but preserved in the dry underground air. Sarah reluctantly approached, her flashlight illuminating page after page of meticulous records written in various hands across different decades. Names, dates, amounts of money, and beside each entry a single word that made Sarah's stomach lurch, silenced. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It's a kill list." Marcus flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with each entry. "Look at the amounts, Sarah. Thousands of dollars next to each name. Someone was paying for these deaths." The most recent entries were in Aunt Minerva's careful script. The last name on the list was dated just 3 months ago, the same week Minerva had died. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the final entry aloud. "Thomas Garrett. $15,000. Asking too many questions about the mine. Silenced. That's why she left you the ranch," Marcus said quietly. "She was trying to get out, maybe trying to make amends." A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps crossing the barn floor, slow and deliberate. Sarah clicked off her flashlight and grabbed Marcus's wrist, forcing him to do the same. In the absolute darkness, they could hear muffled voices through the floorboards above. "Told you she'd lead us right to it." The voice was unfamiliar, rough with age and cigarettes. "Minerva was always too sentimental," came another voice. This one Sarah recognized with a chill. Deputy Crawford. "Should have burned everything when the old woman died. Too late for that now. The pregnant girl knows too much." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt Marcus's hand find hers in the darkness, squeezing tight. "What about the federal marshal?" Crawford asked. "He's asking questions in town. Won't be long before he puts the pieces together. We finish this tonight, make it look like an accident. Gas leak, maybe." Boom. The footsteps moved closer to where Sarah remembered seeing a trapdoor entrance near the altar. She tugged Marcus toward the stairs, feeling along the wall in the blackness. "Money's already moved," the first voice continued. "Accounts closed, evidence destroyed. After tonight it'll be like none of this ever happened." Sarah's foot hit something that clattered across the stone floor. The voices above stopped abruptly. "What was that?" "Check the cellar." The trapdoor creaked open, sending a shaft of weak light into the underground chamber. Sarah and Marcus pressed themselves against the stone wall beside the stairs, holding their breath as a heavy flashlight beam swept the room below. "Nobody here," Crawford called up. "Just rats. Make sure. We can't afford loose ends." Crawford's boots appeared on the wooden ladder leading down from the trapdoor. Sarah could see his gun drawn, held ready as he descended into the cellar. In the backwash of his flashlight, she caught Marcus's eye and saw him pointing toward the stairs they'd used to enter. But as they crept toward their escape route, Sarah's foot caught the edge of the open ledger. It crashed to the floor, pages scattering. Crawford spun toward the sound, his light finding them immediately. Well, looks like we got ourselves a couple of rats after all." The deputy's gun swung toward Sarah, and she saw her death in his cold eyes. But Marcus was already moving, launching himself at Crawford with a roar that echoed off the stone walls. The two men crashed into the wooden table, sending decades of evidence flying. "Run!" Marcus shouted as he grappled with Crawford for control of the weapon. Sarah stumbled toward the stairs, her pregnant body clumsy in the darkness. Behind her she heard the struggle intensifying, Crawford cursing as Marcus fought desperately to keep the gun pointed away from her. A shot rang out in the confined space, deafeningly loud. Then, silence. Sarah reached the top of the stairs and looked back, her heart stopping as she saw only one figure still standing in the flashlight's glow below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Elena stood in the kitchen, hands pressed against her swollen belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing the tension that crackled through the old house like electricity before a storm. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Martinez's patrol car disappear down the dusty road, carrying with it the last of the evidence bags containing generations of Blackwood secrets. Marcus emerged from the root cellar, his face grim. "It's worse than we thought," he said, setting down a wooden crate filled with yellowed documents. "I found 3 more ledgers hidden behind the false wall. The silver operation wasn't just stealing from other claims. They were using it to launder money for a network that stretched from here to San Francisco." Elena sank into a chair, the weight of revelation heavy on her shoulders. "No wonder someone's been so desperate to get us off this land. We're sitting on evidence of crimes that could destroy families, businesses, maybe even political careers." "The question is," Marcus said, opening one of the ledgers, "how many people knew about this? And how far are they willing to go to keep it buried?" As if summoned by his words, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning quiet. Elena moved to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. 3 black SUVs were making their way up the ranch road, moving with the deliberate precision of a military convoy. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "we have company." He was beside her in an instant, peering through the curtains. The vehicles stopped in a semicircle in front of the house, and men in expensive suits began emerging. They moved like predators, confident and coordinated. "These aren't local players," Marcus said, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. "Someone called in the cavalry." The lead figure, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, approached the front porch. His companions fanned out with practiced efficiency, their jackets bulging with concealed weapons. Elena recognized the type from her years working cases in the city, corporate fixers, the kind of men who made problems disappear. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Elena and Marcus exchanged glances, both understanding that this moment would define everything that came after. "Ms. Vasquez," the man's voice carried through the door, smooth and cultured. "My name is Richard Caldwell. I represent certain interested parties. I believe we have matters to discuss." Elena opened the door but kept the screen latched. "I don't recall inviting you onto my property, Mr. Caldwell." Caldwell's smile never wavered. "Your property, yes. Quite the inheritance you've received. But I think you'll find that ownership can be complicated when it comes to the Blackwood legacy. What do you want?" Marcus stepped into view, his presence a clear warning. "Practical people," Caldwell said approvingly. I represent a consortium of families whose ancestors had business dealings with the Blackwoods. Recent developments suggest that certain historical misunderstandings might come to light. We're here to offer a solution that benefits everyone. Elena felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to the danger. Let me guess, you want to buy the ranch? For considerably more than market value, Caldwell confirmed, producing an envelope from his jacket. Enough to ensure a comfortable life for you and your child, far from the complications of the past. Marcus scanned the men positioned around the house. And if we refuse? Caldwell's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The West has always been an unforgiving place, Mr. Torres. Accidents happen, people disappear. Sometimes the burden of the past becomes too heavy to bear. Elena's mind raced. The evidence Sheriff Martinez had taken was only part of what they'd found. The most damaging documents were still hidden in the ranch house, tucked away in locations even the sheriff didn't know about. These men clearly didn't realize how much she and Marcus had uncovered, or they would have already acted with violence instead of negotiation. I need time to consider your offer, Elena said finally. Of course, Caldwell replied, though his tone suggested anything but patience. But understand, this is a limited-time opportunity. The consortium I represent values discretion above all else. If this matter becomes public, then other solutions will be necessary. He placed the envelope on the porch railing and stepped back. 24 hours, Ms. Vasquez? Choose wisely. The men retreated to their vehicles with the same coordinated precision, leaving Elena and Marcus alone with the weight of an impossible decision. As the SUVs disappeared down the road, Elena picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a cashier's check for $2 million. They're scared, Marcus said quietly. Scared enough to offer a fortune, but confident enough to make threats. That tells us something important. Elena nodded, her hand moving protectively over her belly. They think they hold all the cards. They don't know about the safe behind Great-Aunt Iris's portrait or the documents hidden in the barn. The question is, Marcus said, what are we willing to risk to make sure the truth comes out? The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch yard as Elena pressed her back against the weathered barn wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through a crack in the wooden planks, she could see 3 black SUVs parked near the main house, their engines still ticking as they cooled. Men in dark suits moved with practiced efficiency, their voices carrying on the desert wind. "Check the house again," one of them barked. "She has to be here somewhere." Elena's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant, running wasn't exactly an option, but staying put meant certain death. The Castellanos family had finally tracked her down, just as Great-Aunt Mercy had warned in her cryptic journal entries. The silver mine wasn't just a fortune, it was blood money, and they wanted it back. She'd spent the last 3 days since uncovering the truth about the mine's origins trying to figure out what to do. The journal had revealed everything, how her great-great-grandfather had murdered Vicente Castellanos in 1892 and stolen his claim, how the family had been searching for their lost patriarch's mine for over a century, and how every generation of her family had paid the price for that original sin. A boot crunched on gravel nearby, and Elena held her breath. Through the crack, she saw a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes directing the search. This had to be Don Castellanos himself, the patriarch she'd read about in old newspaper clippings, a man who'd built an empire on violence and never forgot a debt. "The locals say she's been living here for months," the man said into his phone. "Pregnant and alone. She can't have gone far." Elena closed her eyes, remembering Sheriff Martinez's words from their last conversation. He'd been trying to help her, she realized now, when he'd suggested she leave town. He'd known they were coming. The question was whether he was friend or foe when the chips were down. A sudden kick from the baby made her gasp softly, and she pressed both hands to her belly, willing her child to be still. She thought of the ultrasound photo tucked in her wallet, of the nursery she'd started to set up in the ranch house, of all the dreams she'd built around this place, dreams that were crumbling, as surely as the ranch's foundation. "Boss," another voice called out. "Found something in the kitchen. Coffee's still warm and there's baby stuff everywhere. She was here this morning." Elena's mind raced. She needed to get to her truck, but it was parked near the house, directly in their line of sight. The only other option was the old mining trail that led up into the hills behind the property. It was treacherous terrain, even for an experienced hiker, let alone a heavily pregnant woman, but it might be her only chance. She waited until the voices moved toward the other side of the house, then carefully worked her way along the barn wall toward the back. Each step felt like a lifetime, her boots seeming impossibly loud on the packed earth. The baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing her distress. As she reached the corner of the barn, she nearly collided with a figure emerging from the shadows. Her heart stopped until she recognized the weathered face of Tom Hawkins, the old rancher from the neighboring property. "This way," he whispered urgently, gesturing toward a gully that ran behind the outbuildings. "Trucks waiting in the wash." Elena hesitated for a split second. Could she trust him? But the sound of voices growing closer made the decision for her. She followed Tom into the narrow ravine, grateful for his steady hand on her elbow as they navigated the uneven ground. His pickup truck sat hidden beneath an overhang of mesquite trees, its engine running. "Get in," he said, helping her into the passenger seat. "We need to move fast." As they pulled away from the ranch, staying low in the wash to avoid detection, Elena finally found her voice. "Why are you helping me?" Tom's jaw was set in a hard line. "Because I know what they did to your family before. My grandfather told me stories about the Castellanos bunch and how they came looking for revenge back in the 20s. Your great-grandmother barely escaped with her life." The pieces were falling into place now. The mysterious deaths, the family members who disappeared over the decades. It hadn't been accidents or coincidence. It had been a slow, methodical hunt, spanning generations. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as they climbed out of the wash and onto a dirt road she didn't recognize. "Safe house," Tom replied grimly. "Sheriff Martinez set it up yesterday. He's been watching the roads, waiting for them to show up." He glanced at her belly. "Question is, what are you planning to do about that mine? Because hiding won't work forever. They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Elena stared out at the vast desert landscape, her hand resting on her unborn child. Somewhere behind them, dangerous men were tearing apart the only real home she'd ever known, searching for her and the fortune that had cursed her family for over a century. The sound of approaching horses cut through the dawn air like a warning bell. Sarah pressed herself against the barn wall, her hand instinctively moving to protect her growing belly as she peered through a gap between the weathered boards. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. Marcus Blackwood sat tall in his saddle, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. One wore a badge that caught the early sunlight, while the other had the lean, predatory look of someone accustomed to violence. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they held all the cards. Sarah's fingers tightened around the leather journal she'd found in the hidden room beneath the house. Inside its pages lay the truth about the Hartwell fortune, not just the location of the gold, but the blood-soaked history of how it came to be buried beneath her inherited land. Her great-aunt Elena's careful handwriting had revealed decades of secrets, including the real reason the Blackwood family had been circling like vultures for so long. The riders pulled up in front of the main house, and Sarah heard Marcus call out in his smooth, practiced voice. "Mrs. Chen? I know you're here. Your truck's still warm." She closed her eyes, thinking of Tom, who should be returning from town within the hour. He'd gone to speak with the real sheriff, the one who wasn't in Marcus's pocket, about what they'd discovered. But an hour felt like an eternity now. "We found something interesting in the county records," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the yard. "Seems your great-aunt was more than just an eccentric recluse. She was harboring some dangerous information about my family, information that could cause a lot of unnecessary trouble." Sarah bit her lip. Elena's journal had been explicit about the murders. 3 people over the decades who had gotten too close to the truth about the stolen gold. The original theft from a Wells Fargo shipment in 1887 had been blamed on Apache raiders, but it was Marcus's great-grandfather and his partners who had orchestrated the robbery. When the partners grew nervous about keeping the secret, they'd started disappearing one by one. Elena had suspected the truth for years, but it wasn't until she'd witnessed the murder of a prospector who'd found traces of gold near the property line that she'd begun keeping detailed records. She'd been too afraid to go to the authorities. The Blackwood influence ran too deep, but she'd documented everything, waiting for the right moment. "I think we should have a conversation about your plans for this property," Marcus called out again. Face to face. Sarah's heart pounded as she weighed her options. The journal was evidence, but would it be enough? Marcus had spent his entire life building legitimate businesses to mask his family's criminal foundation. He had judges, sheriffs, and politicians in his pocket. One pregnant woman with a moldy journal might not be enough to bring him down. But she had something else now, something Elena had hidden even more carefully than her written records. Moving as quietly as she could, Sarah slipped toward the back of the barn, where she'd discovered Elena's final secret. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was a metal box containing not just documents, but photographs. Images of Marcus's grandfather meeting with known criminals, pictures of bodies being moved under cover of darkness, and most damning of all, a photograph of the stolen gold bars still bearing their Wells Fargo stamps. The sound of boots on the front porch made her freeze. They weren't waiting for her to come out. "Search the house," she heard Marcus order, "and be thorough. She's found something, or she wouldn't have gone to such lengths to hide." Glass shattered somewhere inside the house, probably the kitchen window. Sarah clutched the metal box tighter, her mind racing. She needed to get to town, to reach Tom and the honest sheriff before Marcus realized what she'd uncovered. But as she prepared to make her move, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the wail of a baby crying somewhere in the distance. It took her a moment to realize the sound was coming from the old root cellar near the property's edge, the same cellar where Elena had documented seeing bodies being hidden decades ago. The crying grew louder, and Sarah realized with horror that it wasn't a baby at all. It was Tom. Her stomach dropped as she understood the trap. Marcus hadn't come here hoping to find her. He already knew exactly where she was. The question was whether she would trade her evidence for Tom's life, or whether Marcus planned to eliminate them both regardless. As footsteps approached the barn from multiple directions, Sarah made her choice. She pressed the metal box against her chest and stepped out into the morning light, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm here," she called out. "Let's talk." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Sarah stood on the front porch, her hand resting on her rounded belly. 3 months had passed since that terrible night when bullets shattered the quiet and blood soaked into the desert sand. The FBI had finally closed their investigation, the cartel connections severed, and the last of Vincent Moreau's associates either dead or behind bars. Detective Hayes climbed out of his patrol car, a manila envelope tucked under his arm. His face had aged in these months, the weight of uncovering 3 generations of buried secrets etched in the lines around his eyes. "Mrs. Chen," he said, tipping his hat as he approached, "I have the final paperwork. The last of the legal complications have been resolved." Sarah nodded, gesturing toward the porch swing. "Coffee? That'd be welcome." As she poured from the thermos she'd brought outside, Hayes opened the envelope. "The court has officially cleared the ranch of all claims. The money your great-aunt hid, what's left of it after restitution to the families of Moreau's victims, it's legally yours. No liens, no outstanding debts, no federal seizures." Sarah sipped her coffee, watching a hawk circle overhead. "How much?" "After everything, still close to $2 million. Your great-aunt Clara was apparently better at hiding money than her father was at stealing it." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd arrived here with $47 and a beat-up Honda, running from an empty life and an emptier bank account. Now she had more money than she'd ever dreamed of, but it felt heavier than the poverty she'd known. "The contractor says the main house restoration will be finished next month," she said. "Just in time." Hayes smiled, his eyes dropping to her belly. Boy or girl? Girl. I'm thinking of naming her Clara. I think your great-aunt would like that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the desert bloom with late spring wildflowers. The violence that had erupted here seemed impossible now, as if it belonged to some other timeline. But Sarah knew the truth lived in the scars. The bullet hole in the kitchen wall she'd left unfilled as a reminder, the new locks on every door, the way she still jumped when trucks backfired on the distant highway. "There's something else," Hayes said finally. "Something I thought you should know, even though it's not in any official report." Sarah turned to face him. "We found journals in Vincent's belongings. Turns out he'd been obsessed with your family for years. Long before the money disappeared, his grandfather had worked for your great-great-grandfather Ezra, back when this place was a working cattle ranch. Poor man got caught up in Ezra's schemes, lost everything when the law finally caught up. Vincent wasn't just after money. He wanted revenge for something that happened over a century ago." The baby kicked, and Sarah placed both hands on her belly. "So it really is over." "It is. The past can't hurt you anymore." But Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. The past had left her this place, this money, this child who would grow up carrying the weight of family history in her DNA. The difference was choice. Ezra had chosen greed and violence. Clara had chosen secrecy and isolation. Sarah was choosing something different. "I've been thinking about turning part of the ranch into a shelter," she said. "For women like I was, pregnant, broke, nowhere to go. Maybe some good can come from all this." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Your great-aunt would definitely like that." After he left, Sarah walked through the property, her daily ritual now. She passed the spot where Miguel had died, protecting her, marked now with a simple stone she'd had engraved. She touched the old oak tree where Clara had buried the first cache of money, its bark scarred but still growing. She ended at the family cemetery, where 4 generations of her bloodline lay beneath weathered headstones. The newest grave belonged to Clara, whose remains she'd had properly buried after the FBI released them. Sarah had found a photograph in the house, Clara as a young woman, smiling beside the same oak tree. The resemblance between them was startling, as if genetics had skipped generations to find her. As evening approached, Sarah returned to the house. The baby was active tonight, rolling and stretching like she was eager to enter the world. Sarah imagined teaching her daughter to ride horses, showing her the secret places on the ranch, telling her the whole truth about their family, both the darkness and the light. The phone rang as she was making dinner. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was warm. "Sarah, this is Maria Santos. I hope you don't mind me calling. Detective Hayes gave me your number. I'm pregnant, and I have nowhere to go. He said you might be able to help." Sarah smiled, watching the sunset paint the desert gold through her kitchen window. "Of course. Come whenever you're ready. There's plenty of room here." The past was finally buried. The future was just beginning.